Welcome to the Ada Lovelace Day podcast. My name is Sue Charman Anderson, and every month I talk to women from around the STEM world about their work, as well as talking to women and men about historic and modern women's achievements, discoveries and inventions. Our podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of ARM, our exclusive semiconductor industry sponsor. You can find out more about ARM's energy-efficient microprocessor technology on their website at arm.com, and you can follow them on Twitter at @ARMHoldings. If you'd like to join ARM as a co-sponsor of our podcast, then please email me at suw@findingada.com. In this episode, we're talking to structural engineer Roma Agrawal about her work on the iconic Shard skyscraper in London and the challenges of retrofitting Victorian buildings. We'll also hear from biological psychologist Dr Pete Etchells about the work of Dr Suzanne Gage, who investigates the relationships between recreational drug use and mental health. So this month we're talking to Roma Agrawal, who's a structural engineer. And Roma, you worked on the basement and the spire of the Shard, which for our listeners who aren't familiar with London is an incredibly shiny new building that looks fantastic in the right light and sometimes looks a little bit like the Eye of Sauron. So Roma, what was it like working on such an iconic building?
It was just so much fun. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. So I spent about 6 years of my career working on the project. And I know that sounds like quite a long time, but during that time, I actually worked on so many different aspects of the building. So I spent a little bit of time working on the structures around the tower, because when you're actually trying to put something up in the middle of a busy city like London, you have to think about everything that's surrounding you. So I had to sort of chop and change Victorian structures that were built in the 1960s, a bus station, part of the train station. And so I spent a bit of time working on that. And that was really, really interesting because I got to look at these really old drawings from archives and try and work out how these old structures were built. And then I spent a bit of time down in the ground. So understanding how the history of London and its geology actually affects new skyscrapers going up in the city. So London has very soft, squishy clay that we have to build on, not a great material at all. So I looked at how we can design the actual foundations that will keep the building standing up and stable. And finally, I worked on the very top of the tower, which is super because I can basically walk around London, and if I see the Shard, then I can point at it and say, well, I helped design that bit.
That is amazing. And it is the top of the Shard that people pay the most attention to, because it is very distinctive and it's quite spectacular, especially, like I say, when it catches the sun in the right way. It's quite amazing. When you were working on it, did you imagine that it would have that kind of impact visually?
I knew it was going to be very unusual, but I didn't think it would be just as beautiful as it actually is. And I think one of the reasons I particularly love it is because you can see every single nut and bolt and piece of steel up there, which is a structural engineer's dream, really, because we spend so much time working with these industrial materials like steel and concrete, which then often get painted or covered up. But at the top of the Shard, you can really see the actual skeleton of the building shining through.
It is really sort of fantastic. But ultimately, it's the work in the basement that keeps the whole thing standing up.
Yes, you're right. So it's often the case that you design things which get hidden away and no one will ever see them. But those are, in fact, the most important parts of the structure.
And it's kind of, I think it's interesting that, you worked on the basement and you worked on the spire, and it feels a little bit, to a non-engineer, it's kind of like, maybe those two different skill sets, a variety of skills, because you're dealing with, holding the building up and then finishing the building off.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I had to learn to work in very different environments. So in the ground, it's actually quite an uncertain place. So we do understand how clay works, but it depends on how old the clay is. If things have been built on it before, there might be faults. There's a geological fault on the site. There's other materials mixed in with the clay. So yes, we know how perfect clay works, but it's never perfect on site. And what I had to really learn about at the bottom of the building was dealing with that uncertainty. How do you take this material, which is a little bit unpredictable, and still apply sound engineering principles to it to make sure that your finished product works? And a lot of that is about working with the experts in the field. So I'm always talking to different engineers to understand how clay behaves, how towers behave, how heavy they are, how it's going to affect the ground, how much it's going to squash it. And you'd really have to think through all the various different scenarios of loading and how the clay is going to respond to that. So that was really, really interesting in one sense. And then the top of the building, because it's such a visual thing and because millions of people are going to come up to this viewing gallery and look out at the view, the architects were really keen that it looked perfect. And so on that side, I spent a lot of time working with the architects when I was designing the steel to show them exactly how every single connection would look, because they wanted it to be really slick and nicely done so that they could leave it open. So you're right, there were absolutely different skills that were needed for the two different parts of the same building.
So, when we think about engineering, we often think about rulers and straight lines and calculators. And I'm wondering, like, how much of your work is theoretical, is working with sort of calculations and computers and stuff, and how much of your work is on site? How much time did you actually spend on the shard, watching as it was built?
Yep, I think you're right about the image of engineering. We think of it as being very technical, very mathematical. And of course, the other flip side of is that I'm always in a hard hat in mud. So yes, both those aspects are true and are part of what I particularly do, which is structural engineering. And in terms of how much time I spend, I spend a fair amount of time on a computer modeling things in all the kind of software that we now have. Technology has really changed engineering in a way that's been unprecedented. And we can use computers and software to really help us design these complicated geometrical structures. And then I do spend a bit of time on site as well. And I really enjoy that, because after spending months or even years designing things theoretically, on a piece of paper or on a screen, you're actually now out there seeing the full-sized real thing being built. So I actually find that part of my job very, very rewarding. But the third aspect of my job, which I think really is what drives me in engineering, is the huge amount of creativity that's involved. So every single day, whether I'm on a computer, whether I'm doing calculations on a calculator, or I'm on site trying to watch concrete being poured or steel being fixed, we are faced with problems and we have to solve those problems. Now, there is no right or wrong answer for how you solve things. And a lot of what I have to do is to think about the different options to solve that problem, but think about the best way to do it. And sometimes the best way to solve a problem is not something that's ever been tried before. And that's when it starts to get really, really interesting. So for me, that creative process of coming up with ideas and methods that no one's ever thought of before to come up with the best solution to a problem is really what drives me.
It sounds like you need to be very imaginative, but I guess also as well quite good at a bit of lateral thinking.
Yes, the lateral thinking is very important, because if we just sat there and solved problems or did things in the same way as everyone did before us, then we would still be stuck only building out of brick and, in low-rise structures. But the fact that we are now competing to build a kilometre-high tower is a testament to the fact that you have to think beyond what's currently possible as an engineer to achieve the next great thing.
The idea of a kilometre-high tower is that's quite mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we're not far off because the Burj Khalifa is over 800 meters. So there's not that far to go before we'll be able to reach a kilometre.
Do you think that would ever happen in London? I mean, is the Shard the tallest building in London now?
The Shard is definitely the tallest building in London. In fact, it's the tallest building in Western Europe. And what happens in a lot of big metropolitan cities is that the planes and the flight paths actually dictate how tall you can go. So it's not about what engineers can actually achieve. It's actually thinking about our surroundings and what's feasible around, transport and people and the river and other things that are around it and the ground and so on.
I would never have thought actually about the impact of air traffic. But of course, London is an interesting city because you've got Heathrow, it's one of the busiest airports in the world, but you've also got City Airport, which is right in the middle of London.
That's right, and that's why there are very, very strict rules about how tall you can actually build in London. And the Shard is very tall, and there's not a huge amount of space left between the top of the Shard and where the flight paths are. So if a taller building is to come along in London, it'll have to be very strategically located in a way where the airspace is actually higher up.
I would never have even considered that. But I think that just goes to show how broad your knowledge has to be as an engineer, that actually when you're not just taking into account, material strengths and angles and all that, you've got to understand a bit about the geology of where you're building, about sort of air traffic lanes. And it seems like there's actually not just a lot of creativity, but a lot to learn and a really sort of fascinatingly broad amount of stuff to engage with and to learn.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on a really important point there, which is that what I do is very, very human, because ultimately the structures which I'm involved in, that I'm building or refurbishing or whatever I'm doing, at the end of the day, there will be people walking, living, eating, drinking, sleeping in these structures. And you're right, I'm not building a tower in the middle of a desert or a field where it doesn't affect anything. I'm building in the middle of a city where there are train tunnels very close to or sometimes underneath your buildings. There are other buildings being built around you. There's hospitals, there's schools. You have to think about noise. So it is such a very human subject that you really do need to think about all of your surroundings and be considerate and compassionate about all of that.
You've worked on quite a variety of different types of projects, because obviously, we talk about the Shard because it's a massive and impressive building, and you can't really go to London and not spot the Shard at some point. But you've also worked on footbridges and sort of Victorian refurbishments and all sorts of stuff, haven't you?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's another thing I really love about engineering is that it's just so broad in the things that I can learn, and I never stop learning because every single new project that I do is different in some respect. My first ever project was this beautiful little footbridge in Newcastle for Northumbria University, and I still remember I came into work on my first day and was given this fantastic hand sketch that my boss had done of this bridge. And I then spent the next 18 months doing the calculations for the foundations for that bridge, the actual cables and the steel deck, the thing that you walk on, and also on how it vibrates, because we've heard about the story of the Millennium Bridge in London, which started vibrating when people walked on it. And that's one of the things that I had to look at on my footbridge. So that was a very specific type of, mathematical analysis that I had to do, which was really fascinating. And then on the flip side, I've also worked on old Victorian structures, as you mentioned. And one particular example is a train station that was built in the 1800s out of brick. And here I'm now working with an existing building that's already got its material in there, it's got its load in there. And now I'm almost doing like a forensic exam on this existing structure. How was it built? How does it work? Where are all the loads going? Is it still strong enough to hold all this weight? And what's going to happen when my new bridge or my new lift or the new roof I'm trying to put in, how does that affect what these engineers that designed it over 150 years ago, how's it going to affect that? So you then bring this whole other set of skills and knowledge about trying to understand something backwards. And that was really fascinating as well.
Now, I've watched a bit of grand designs in my time, and the one lesson, or one of many lessons you bring away from that, is that old structures always have skeletons in their closets. Is that the same in engineering? You always find something you weren't expecting?
You do always find something you weren't expecting. I can remember one of the buildings I worked on, which was an old Georgian building. So that was built in the 1700s. Then it was refurbished in the 1800s, in the 1920s, and in the 1960s. And then in around 2010, I'm coming in and saying, well, I want to put a brand new roof in to get more light into this building and, open some rooms out. And when we started looking into the ceilings and stripping back the plaster on the walls and that structure, we just found layer upon layer of this history. And it was fascinating because we didn't even know the number of times it had been refurbished or some works had been done to it. And it really was like, in a way, being an archaeologist, kind of dusting away layers and then finding something unexpected. So whilst that can be quite frustrating, it's also really, really interesting just to see how engineers in different eras thought and did things and how much things have moved on.
Because it's a very innovative space, engineering. The evolution of engineering techniques over, not just the centuries, but even recently, as we get new materials and that, there must be a lot to keep up with.
Yes, there's new materials coming up on the horizon, but apart from new materials, even our existing materials are changing. You're able to create stronger steel today than you could before. You can join it up in better ways than you could before. Concrete's getting stronger. It's getting more eco-friendly. You can mix stuff into concrete so that the embodied carbon of it goes down. So we have to keep thinking about all these innovations and understand how these innovations can actually be applied to a practical project. And again, there's an interesting balance to be struck there because you might have this fantastic new technology which will make things a little bit quicker, but at the same time make it way more expensive. And then the question is, what do you do? Do you go with the old tried and tested way of doing things, or do you change it up? Or it's one of those really interesting debates that we often have when we're starting to design a new structure.
And of course, you also got to think about longevity, that, you might have a brand new material or a new adaptation of an existing material, but, your buildings are going to be around for a long, long time. So, that must also play into it.
Well, that's definitely the plan. If my buildings weren't going to be around for a long time, then I'd be worried. So, but you're right. Things have to last well. So it's fine to design something which will last for, 100 years or something. But if you have to keep coming in and maintaining it, and you have issues with water leakages, or the steel gets damaged, or the paint wears out, then it's not a successful end product. You need to have something that's easy to maintain and that people are going to enjoy living in or working in. So longevity is very, very important, and that comes down really to good design and choosing the right materials. So if we understand what the building's going to be used for, who's going to occupy it, how worn out it's going to get over a time period, then we can choose the right material that will fulfill that brief.
What's kind of like the favourite aspect of your job? I mean, what is it that gets you really excited?
I think it's the end product that drives me. So the fact that I will spend years doing calculations, going to site, solving issues, working with people, but what I get at the end of that is a real life-sized building, a huge bridge, something that's actually going to change people's lives. That's what it is for me. Making an impact on London's skyline, that's a huge legacy and very, very rewarding.
And not many people, I think, that can say that they've been a part of that. I mean, London skyline changes rapidly, but still, I mean, it must be nice to look up and see the Shard.
It's just amazing, and I keep seeing it pop up in places that I would, absolutely least expect. But it's also the smaller scale thing. So I mentioned this railway station that I worked on, and it was a really old station, and what we did there was to put 3 new lifts in and some new walkways. And what that meant was that people with mobility issues or disabled people could suddenly use this station. And that means just as much to me because I have then helped make someone's life a little bit easier. And that's incredibly important to me as well.
What do you think are the most important qualities that you bring to your work and that you see in other successful engineers?
I think there's a few different qualities that come together to create a really successful engineer. So, of course, the obvious one is being technically very good. So being good at maths and physics is important, of course. But I think there's 2 other things that really make you an outstanding engineer. One of them is being creative and having that visual sense, being able to see things in different dimensions and put things together, and that attitude of wanting to create options and solve problems is very, very important. And the other one is about people. So it's very clear that putting together a footbridge or a building is a very, very complicated process. And there are so many different people involved, from the client who's actually paying for the thing, to the project managers, to the people doing the costing, to the architects, to the scores of engineers that work on a project. And the best projects are when all of that ties together beautifully to create an end product. So being able to work with different people who have different intentions, that want different things, but for the same outcome is incredibly, incredibly important. So being a people person, being able to negotiate, being able to communicate with other engineers is crucial.
I think it's interesting you say that, because this is a thing that comes up quite often in these conversations that I'm having is around collaboration. And I think we do have a very Victorian view of engineers. We still kind of imagine Brunel striding around and telling people what to do, but it's not really like that. It's a much more collaborative process.
I think every single project that I've worked on has had thousands of people involved in it, and every single one of those people wants to finish the project, but they all have different pressures that are applied on them. And we have to work together to solve that and move forward. I think gone are the days of one engineer, the face of the project, telling people what to do. It's definitely a very, very kind of team collaboration effort nowadays. You wouldn't be able to build a project otherwise.
So what are you most looking forward to? What's coming up for you that's getting you excited?
So what's really exciting at the moment is that I'm now working in the construction side of things. So I spent the first 10 years of my career designing, and we talked a lot about the design. And now what I'm doing is really around the logistics of how do you actually build stuff. So if I know that a piece of steel for a particular column is needed on site by a particular day, then I need to break down what are all the steps that need to happen in order for that piece of steel to arrive on site on that day. And it's a little bit like TV production. You want to come one day on a set and film a scene, but there's all this planning that goes behind the actors getting there, the sets being designed and built, and all the right people being there with all the equipment that they need. And what I'm now doing is a very similar role to TV production in a way. And this has been a really interesting change for me because I'm now able to see construction from a much, much broader point of view. And the more and more I do this, the more astounded I am at how complicated building something is. And I sometimes just wonder, how do we actually do it? Like, how do these millions of moving parts come together and actually work? But they do. They just somehow do.
Thank you so much, Roma, for talking to us this month. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's been such a pleasure.
If you'd like to see Roma talk about bridge design and engineering, you can watch our video from Ada Lovelace Day Live 2014 on our website. You can also read an excerpt of her Passion for Science chapter about Emily Warren Roebling, who became the chief engineer for the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. This month I'm with Dr Pete Etchells, a biological psychologist at Bath Spa University and also the Science Blog Network coordinator at The Guardian. So who is it that has been your inspiration?
So my inspiration, and she's probably going to kill me for suggesting this, is a very good friend of mine called Dr Suzanne Gage, who's an epidemiologist who's based at the University of Bristol in the UK.
So what is it about Susie that you found so inspirational?
Lots of things, actually. So I know Susie through a number of different circles. So obviously we're friends, but I know her in an academic setting as well. So we've worked together on a couple of different projects before now and continue to do so. I also know Susie as an excellent science communicator as well. So Susie writes a blog for The Guardian called Sifting the Evidence, where she talks about the science behind different sorts of health headlines that you might see in the news and whether they're things to worry about or not. So it's really through all of these different realms that I know Susie, that I've kind of come to sort of treat her as an inspiration, really, both as a researcher and as a science communicator.
And tell me a little bit more about Susie's work as a researcher first. Looking at her bio, I mean, she does an awful lot of what I think to be like the really fascinating end of looking into how lifestyle affects mental health, and this is something that I think is a deeply important question in modern society.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah, so Susie's an epidemiologist, and epidemiology is essentially the sort of study of different patterns of maybe disease outbreak or health conditions, and also kind of the causes and the effects of some of those conditions in large-scale populations. I've had some friends who kind of liken epidemiology to sort of being a health detective in some ways, trying to figure out why things that happen on a large scale in the public do happen, and is there anything that we can do to solve those issues. So Susie's work in particular is kind of centres on investigating whether there are the links that we see between different types of health behaviours. So that might be things like taking drugs or smoking or drinking alcohol, whether those sorts of health behaviours and the links that we see with mental health issues, so things like depression and schizophrenia, what is the nature of those links? So is it that one causes the other, or is it just that they're kind of correlated with each other?
That's really interesting. And some of her work as well has been around sort of like longitudinal studies, the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, and these are important studies, these long-term projects.
Yeah, absolutely. The Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, it's also called the Children of the 90s study. It's a brilliant study, actually. So essentially what happened was in the very early 1990s, all of the prospective mums-to-be in the kind of Bristol area in the UK were approached and asked if they wanted to take part in this study. Obviously, some of them said no, but some of them said yes. I think they ended up with about 15,000 parents in the end. So these researchers followed these parents through childbirth, and then followed them and their children for the next sort of 21 or so years. So kind of very specific time points. Through those years, say every 6 months or every year or so, they would go through different sorts of testing. So that might be questionnaires, or they might take genetic samples, say. So what we've ended up with over the past 25 years or so is a hugely rich data set that just traces the entire behavioural and genetic lives of a huge number of people within the Bristol area. And what that sort of information allows us to do is ask really difficult questions that with an experimental study where you're only testing, say, 30 people or so, you can't really answer. So Susie's work is a really good example of this. So as I said before, she's looking at whether the links that we see between different types of health behaviour and mental health issues are causal in nature. So what I mean by that is that, say you look at people who have depression or schizophrenia. Now, you tend to find that groups of individuals with those mental illnesses also show higher levels of smoking, drinking alcohol, maybe taking drugs. Now, the interesting question there is, do those individuals have depression or schizophrenia because they're smoking or drinking? Now, that's an important question to ask, because if the answer is yes, then that information will help to inform public health initiatives that are aimed at reducing mental health issues in the general population. So, if we find that there is a causal link between drinking alcohol and depression, then we know we can target alcohol use as a way of targeting depression. It's a really difficult question to get to grips with, though, because the answer might actually be the other way around. So it's not that drinking alcohol, say, causes depression, but it's more that if you have depression, you're more likely to drink alcohol, or if you have schizophrenia, you're more likely to try cannabis. So you can argue it's the other way around. It's, having depression causes alcohol intake. Or it could be that some of the factor drives both. So, for example, it could be that if you grew up in a very dysfunctional family environment, that caused you to become depressed. But that dysfunctional family environment also made it more likely for you to try cannabis, or for you to start drinking at an earlier age. So in that situation, what we'd see is that there would be a correlation between those health behaviours and the mental health issue. But actually there's a third factor that accounts for both. Now, if you want to try and answer those sorts of questions, you can't do it in a study that's got, say, 30 people in it. You need thousands and thousands of people, and you need to follow them over a very long period of time. Part of it's to do with ethics. So, you can't do an experiment, say, where you force people to take something that's potentially harmful for their health just to see what happens. But with a longitudinal study, such as the Children of the 90s study, essentially what happens is that over time, some people will try smoking, some people will try cannabis, some people will try drinking, some people won't. Also, over time, some of those individuals will develop depression, or they'll develop schizophrenia. So it's by looking at these large groups of people and seeing what those kind of associations are that we can start answering some of these questions. And that's what Susie's work centres on.
Sounds both complicated but also fascinating. What are some of the conclusions that Susie's so far been able to draw?
It's actually quite a difficult question. It's a very good question, but it's a difficult one to answer. So Susie's PhD work, for instance, looked at the associations between cannabis use and psychotic disorders. And what she found from that research was that there's some evidence that if you use cannabis, it can increase the risks of psychotic disorders. But there's a lot of unknowns around that, so it's not clear what the size of that effect is. Are we talking about a huge problem? So, if you smoke cannabis, you're at a huge risk of developing something like schizophrenia, or is it that just a minor risk? We're not really sure yet. Also, the kind of situation is complicated more by the fact that obviously there are lots of different types of cannabis as well. So there's not just a single strain, there are various sorts of strains. So the research still, at the minute at least, isn't really clear on what the effects are from those different types. And in particular, whether there are certain subgroups of people within the general population that might be particularly susceptible to the effects of some strains over others. Obviously, a lot of people smoke cannabis, and if you smoke cannabis, you tend to do that in conjunction with tobacco. So one of the findings of Susie's work really is highlighted not necessarily a definitive answer, but how difficult it is to separate out the effects of those two substances. So really kind of Susie's work is laying the groundwork for a much more nuanced and much more intelligent and reasonable discussion about what the effects of these different sorts of substances are, and critically whether we can use them to try and identify particularly at-risk individuals in the population, and whether we need to target those for public health initiatives.
And I think this does tie in very closely with the science communication work that Susie does, because a lot of the discussions, particularly around things like drugs and mental health, are very polarized, and quite often the media paint these things as, very simple, X causes Y. And the truth is, it's all a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I struggle to get my head around longitudinal studies sometimes. And one thing that I found with Susie is that she is a great communicator. So she has a wonderful ability to dissect and really get to the heart of some of these very complex issues about health and epidemiology. Really identify two things, really. What the issue is, why is it that something's being misreported in the news? And secondly, how you actually explain it in a really easy to understand way. It's something that I get quite jealous of sometimes, actually. I wish I could do that better.
And it is a real talent to be able to simplify something so that it's more easily understood without actually simplifying it to the point where it's wrong.
Yeah, and I think it's something that a lot of science communicators find difficulty with. It's very easy to, when you start out as a science communicator or as a science writer, science blogger, to be disdainful of stuff that you read in the media that is oversimplified to the point that it comes across wrong, or not necessarily completely wrong, but not quite right. As you do more of this sort of stuff, as you write more for the mass media, it becomes clearer how difficult that is, how difficult it is to get a very clear and succinct message across in, say, 800 words about a topic that, many people would have spent their entire lives researching and still not really kind of got to grips with. It's very difficult to kind of condense it down into a sensible, understandable message that doesn't either go off on a tangent because you need to explain some particular niche bit of statistics, or just kind of ignores all that to the point of being wrong. So Susie has managed to kind of develop a skill in that area that balances all of that out very well. She's able to write something that's not kind of 5,000 words of misery, basically. That's something that's very punchy and to the point, that's correct and interesting to read and useful to know.
Indeed, and actually Susie was one of the contributors to our first anthology of essays about women in STEM, A Passion for Science, and she actually wrote about Jean Golding, OBE, who was the driving force behind the Children of the 90s study, and if anybody wants to read that, there's an excerpt on the website. But that ability, I think sometimes we take for granted, particularly if you're in sort of communications, you take for granted that ability to write and convey information. But it's something I think she has a real talent for. And I've seen that myself.
Yeah, it's very evident. I'm not entirely clear on whether it's something that you can teach, So I've tried to, I do various sorts of science communication courses at the university that I work at, and trying to explain some of these skills to students is in a kind of easy to understand way, in a way in which they can actually use and use to develop those skills. It's quite taxing, actually. So I think Susie has a sort of natural flair for this sort of work. That's not to say that you can't learn. I mean, everybody, writing is a craft, so everybody does learn, and if you make mistakes along the way, then that's hopefully a good learning experience. But I started blogging not too long after Susie. So Susie started it first, and actually it was her writing that in part inspired me to give it a go. But I always felt it was nice to have Susie at that kind of stage a little bit ahead of me, because it was always good to be able to go to somebody who's doing it a little bit better and has a little bit more of an insight into the process to see how you develop in this sort of discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a lot of tools that a writer has, but you also need to have that broader understanding of how to put everything together. How else has Susie inspired you?
I think to go back to sort of the research side of things as well, I can't understate enough or overstate enough how important it is to have a strong knowledge of appropriate statistical analysis techniques for doing research that involves longitudinal studies. And Susie is one of the strongest people that I know in those sorts of areas. So, as an example, we've done some work that got published recently, back in January, about video games. So again, we used the Children of the 90s study to look at this question, which essentially, if you play video games, if you play particularly what you might call violent video games, does that have any sort of long-term effect on behaviour and mental health? Because again, this is something that comes up in the media quite a lot. It's often misreported in the media or sensationalised in the news quite a lot. The research in this area is very conflicting and at times quite divisive. So we wanted to try and tackle this in a very sort of robust and methodical way. So Susie was really the driving force behind both the idea for that study and the analytical techniques behind it. And I very much believe that study wouldn't have been published without her. So I'm very grateful for that, actually.
And I think one of the other things I wanted to touch on with you is the nature of role models, because we so often think of role models as being very senior, late career people, or actually people who've died and their legacy has remained in public awareness. Because, of course, a lot of women who have historically contributed an awful lot to science have essentially sort of been forgotten, and their legacies are largely unexamined. But you've chosen a role model who is not just not dead, but actually more of a peer than a senior colleague. And I wanted to know a little bit more about why you felt that you said in your email when we were talking that you didn't really have a senior role model, and I want to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, so when I was doing my PhD, obviously I did have role models in the sense that I had really wonderful supervisors and people at that sort of level. But when you originally asked me who is your kind of role model for an inspiring woman in science, I struggled with that for quite a long time, actually, and I struggled with it generally in the sense that I find it very difficult to relate to people who I don't really share a connection with. I guess I'm one of those people who sort of very much lives in the moment as well. But I've never really had that feeling or experience of being inspired by somebody from hundreds of years ago, or somebody at a sort of an extremely high level of academia, for a number of reasons, I guess. So if you take the idea of a very kind of high level professor, and a lot of people who might kind of cite somebody as an inspiration, it might be somebody on that level. That's not actually how academia works. It's not the case that if you find somebody inspiring, you are necessarily going to become that person or follow in their footsteps. And we know that there's data to kind of back this up. We know that from a Royal Society study from 2010, it's a report called The Scientific Century. They looked at the transition points in a scientific career in academia following a PhD. So basically, as soon as you get a PhD, over 50% of people leave academia. They go into a career outside science. And if you follow that diagram through, it's a great diagram, by the way. I always like putting it in academic careers talks and horrifying people at the outcome, because there's a perception that you do a PhD, then you do a postdoc, and then you do a lectureship, and then eventually you'll become a professor, and that's what everybody does. Actually, of people who do a PhD in science, less than 0.5% of them will go on to become a professor. So pretty much everybody who does a PhD will get a career outside academia. So I've often found it strange that we put forward some role models who are these people who are professors, and that's not to kind of play down the contributions that they've made both to science and to society. It's more that I think that there are other sorts of role models that we can have that are just as good and just as important, who aren't these high-level people and who aren't these people who maybe died 200-300 years ago.
I think absolutely, and that's always been a bit of a founding ethos for Ada Lovelace Day, that anyone can be a role model, and you can work with someone who is, absolutely inspirational and keeps you sort of motivated and excited about what you do, and it doesn't have to be someone who is is historic. I'm really excited actually that you chose Susie. It's an important point to make. There are role models pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously it goes without saying that the best role models are the people who don't see themselves as that. And I think if you asked Susie, I think she'd probably be really embarrassed to know that I've picked her, and I don't think she would see herself as that necessarily. But it's not in what we say we are or things like that. It's more in what we do. And I think a lot of what Susie does, both in terms of her work and in the way that she supports people as well, kind of play to this idea that she is a very strong role model, not just for me, but for a lot of other people. Actually, she has a blog at The Guardian that she can essentially do whatever she wants with. We're given fairly complete editorial freedom to write about what we want in The Guardian. And if you go through her posts, a lot of the writing there is not from Susie, it's from other people. So she's used that opportunity to get this wonderful, really unique position, to be able to write whatever you want on a major news platform and give that to other people, give that to other early career researchers to write about the things that they're passionate about. Nobody's forced her to do that, but it's something that she's chosen to do. And I think it's actions like that are little things, really. That's not a huge, monumental, life-changing thing that she's done or that anybody could do, but it's something that maybe 5 or 6 years down the line will be reciprocated by somebody that she gave a guest post to, and maybe that will improve things for somebody else.
It's very much I think a culture of pay it forward.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. The nice thing about having role models that are on sort of the same sort of peer level as you is that we can talk about the work that they've done and what's their kind of key contribution to society. One of the most exciting things that I find, and particularly about Susie's research, is that probably the most exciting, the most important finding has yet to come, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what that is.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us this month. It's been really fascinating learning a lot more about Susie, but also talking about the nature of role models. You can find out more about both Pete and Susie on our website. And as I mentioned, we have an excerpt of Susie's chapter on Jean Golding OBE and the Children of the 90s study. Many thanks to Roma and Pete for taking the time to talk to us this month. If you want to find out more about them, just visit our website at findingada.com/EP5. We've got video of Roma's Ada Lovelace Day 2014 talk about bridges, and an excerpt of her biography of Brooklyn bridge engineer Emily Roebling. You can also read an excerpt of Susie Gage's bio of Jean Golding, which explains the genesis of the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children. Also on our website are details of Ada Lovelace Day Live, our fantastic science cabaret, held this year at the IET in London on the 11th of October. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, including climate scientist Dr Anna Jones, web developer Jenny Duckett, science writer Dr Kat Arney, and design engineer Yewandi Akinola. Tickets are on sale now for £20, with concessions at £5, and the link to our Eventbrite page is in the show notes. You can also find out about all our speakers and watch talks from the last 3 Ada Lovelace Day Live events. Thanks again to our sponsor, ARM, for their ongoing support. If you'd like to join them as a podcast sponsor, please get in touch. Thanks also to our editor, Andrew Marks. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play and Stitcher, and you can follow us on Twitter at @FindingAda. Links are, as ever, in the show notes. If you'd like to send us feedback about the show, or if you'd like to take part, you can email me at sue@findingada.com. So join us next month, when we're celebrating Ada Lovelace Day with an astronomy special, in honour of our Ada Lovelace Day Live Platinum sponsor, the Royal Astronomical Society. We'll be talking to Professor Hayley Gomez about how cosmic dust is formed, how it affects our view of the universe, and its role in the formation of planets. We'll also hear from astronomer and astrophysicist Dr Karen Masters about a woman who's very close to my heart, Mary Somerville. So don't forget to tune in next month.